Your Worship.
Just hang on, Alf. Now I want to ask officers. We need a Catherine, a Dean. Anyone else? Rees. Oh, that's right. Right, Councillor Alf.
Your Worship, I know that after the Soul Group gave their kōrero and that, you went to public input, and I know that the Chair and some members of the local board, Māngere o Tāhuhu local board, are here, and I've spoken to them, and they're hoping as well to have a talk. So whether it's now or whether it's after.
Look, I had no idea that request.
Yeah, but I'm just sort of pointing that at Your Worship, and I'll just wait for your call.
Yeah, look, I really want to take officers' views first, I think.
Okay.
We need to try and get this matter moving along. It's a big day. We've got a couple of potential announcements this afternoon, and there are matters that we need to deal with through the balance of this agenda. So let's try and keep things moving now. I've got Dean and I've got Catherine.
Look, thank you, Your Worship. So maybe it would be helpful for us to give a summary of some of the things we've heard, but where we consider we're at, and then we're certainly available for taking any questions to assist.
Yep.
Would that be helpful?
Yep, absolutely.
So as I think Deputy Mayor Hulse summarised as well as I could where this situation is. We were signatories to the Hashar bill. We have signed up to creating special housing areas to address both provision of housing for growth and affordability. And we have been working through taking requests for the creation of special housing areas from across all of Auckland. This was a request. It's the view of staff that we were informed of the issues, and in turn we informed the governing body in the process of making a decision around whether to create an SHA at Uruarangi. The only other comment I'd make is that the way the Hashar legislation is crafted, it focuses on pace and fast tracking. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. So that affects both the outcome, which is the availability of housing throughout Auckland, but it also influences and sets different criteria for whether a special housing area can be created or not. And that includes the adequacy of infrastructure and amongst other things, and it accelerates the zoning provisions within the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan in anticipation of that arriving. It also relies on us informing adjacent landowners in particular, but it doesn't rely on the traditional RMA consultation requirements. So on that note, I think just having set that scene on where we're at, I'd like to hand over to Catherine Anderson, Chief Legal Counsel, and she can just remind us where we're at with respect to the decision that you've made and the Minister's decision. Thank you.
Thanks. As in the paper that was circulated prior to the meeting, this legislation, as Dean said, is very specialised. It's got a limited lifetime, and it's designed fundamentally to fast-track the supply of land. In terms of the processes, you're all familiar with how matters come to you for consideration to recommend to the Minister as to whether an area should be a special housing area. As we've set out in the paper for you in broad terms, which is really just restating what's clear on the face of the legislation, is that you make a recommendation to the Minister decides whether or not to declare an area an SHA, doesn't have to, despite the recommendation from Council. In this particular instance, more than a year ago, the Minister recommended that this be an SHA. An order in Council was prepared and published, available to all the world, declaring this land a special housing area. what the legislation does is limit in very clear terms the basis on which the minister could revoke an SHA. And what I should have said perhaps before I went into what the minister can do is the legislation is time-bound, and at the end, in September next year, every area that's been declared an SHA is by law disestablished. What the minister has is a legal power in advance of that date by which all SHAs cease to exist, to be able to recommend that an area be revoked. And he can only do that on very limited grounds, and only one of those grounds is relevant here, and that is whether the minister's satisfied that the special housing area no longer meets the criteria that is set out in section 16, subsection 3 of the Act. And so those are three areas, and as you will have seen from the minister's letter that's attached to the paper to you, the minister doesn't have any information to support him making a recommendation that those criteria are satisfied. So, short point, very limited basis to revoke. The council's decision to recommend well overtaken by events by the minister having recommended and declared and promulgated this area as an SHA, and very limited powers leading up in the period to September 2016 for the minister to revoke. And on current information, HPO doesn't support any of those criteria on which the minister could revoke being in existence, and that's the minister's initial view as well, that the minister doesn't have the limited grounds under the legislation to revoke.
Okay, now, Christina, Catherine Rather, I just want to take you a little bit before the special housing area, and this is maybe a little bit outside of what you would have been studying over the last day or two, but there's been a lot of discussion this morning about the backstory here for the Humatao community and the preservation of that land. So as a consequence of decades of advocacy by local iwi, Manukau and I think Auckland Regional Council worked pretty closely to get as much of this land as we possibly could back into public ownership. So we own that, and this piece of land that's subject to the special housing area may have been something that we might have looked at in the years ahead, but unfortunately we went through a legal process which in the end brought the Environment Court to a decision that was in support of private ownership of the land. Now, can you just sort of reflect a little bit to us on what that means in terms of going forward with regard to the decision that we need to make today on revocation and any other decisions? Because Te Warana in particular highlighted the fact that, look, we've got to deal with that land. One way or another, it's sitting in private land, it's sitting in private hands, and they have rights. So how does that sort of impact legally in terms of the discussion that we're having here today?
That provides the baseline from which council, as a matter of law, must operate. So yes, despite the position that Auckland Council took, standing side by side with the others before the Environment Court in terms of a public open space zoning, the court recognised the sensitivities of the land but thought the zoning was appropriate as long as things were properly managed. So those recommendations from the Environment Court that became part of the operative plan have been, as I understand it, incorporated into the unitary plan as proposed. So on one scenario, if this land had never been declared an SHA, there would still be an entitlement to look to develop the land in the future under the proposed unitary plan that would reflect the recommendations of the Environment Court as to the appropriate zoning. So it's helpful to look at it on a with or without SHA basis.
Right. And just finally, so that we need to get it really clear here in terms of our ability to revoke, and there's been a little bit of chat this morning about whether or not we could head off to the Governor-General and petition Jerry. Can you give us some really clear view on what that might look like, or whether or not we really have any right in that direction?
Well, can I say that there's nothing to preclude anyone approaching the Governor-General, but there are very strong and fundamental constitutional conventions under which the Governor-General only ever acts on the advice of the Minister, which is why the legislation is crafted that the Minister may only recommend the revocation in certain circumstances. So the Governor-General would never act absent a recommendation from a Minister in general terms, and more specifically, this legislation is very clear, and I'll just emphasise the wording here, is that the Minister must and may only recommend the making of a revocation. So that's very important, the very clear language. He must and may only. So only if these three criteria exist could the Minister recommend the making the revocation. Is if he's satisfied that the special housing area no longer meets the criteria in section 16.3, and I'm focusing on that because that's the only one that can be relevant here. And those criteria are that there's adequate infrastructure exists to service the proposed development or is likely to exist, that there's evidence of demand to create a qualifying development in specific areas, and that there will be demand for residential housing in the proposed special housing area. And those are, of course, reflected in the criteria that the governing body adopted for itself as to how it considers whether to recommend that an area be an SHA.
Okay. Right, councillors, are there any questions of our officials? Councillor Cathy.
If this council decides today to revoke the recommendation to the Minister, what are the consequences of that? We heard somebody say just recently it's a gesture. Is that your legal opinion? Because we can do gestures real easy.
I'm going to confine my response in a technical legal sense. It would be, it would not be legally, it would not legally activate or contribute to a change of the legal position.
Understood. So it is indeed a gesture. Is that your legal opinion?
I'm not making a comment on that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions?
I don't stand down there, actually. I stand
Okay,
in
order,
Alberweed and Roscoe.
order, please. Right, thank you very much, officers. Okay, councillors, I'm going to look. I want to acknowledge Lydia and the local board. I've heard from Councillor Alf.
It's okay, I've spoken to her.
Yeah, okay.
So they're
I
fine.
acknowledge you, and I understand your support. So thank you for being here in support of the community. Okay, there's no extraordinary business. There's a notice of motion under item 10 and is appropriately signed, and that is for a notice of revocation. And I want to acknowledge Councillor Cathy and the notice that you have moved. Councillor Cathy, I just want to, in asking you to speak to your notice of motion, reflect back to you the advice that we've received today. And that advice is that, and so I thought very deeply about whether or not I'd even accept this notice of motion. And that advice is that we cannot, without the Minister's support, and the Minister clearly does not support, that's both in writing and his advice to me, the revocation of a SHA designation for this land. And so there is a very, very clear train of legislation that we need to follow. And in my discussions with the representatives of the iwi, and these discussions are based on discussions over many, many years, and as has been noted, I have stood and has had my predecessors, my councillor colleagues, side by side this community, Ihumatao, as it has fought and sought its recognition and better investment in this land. And it is on this day, though, that I put to you and ask for your reflection that we cannot, either by way of resolution or otherwise, revoke this special housing area, and if we were to, it would be nothing but a gesture. And I most certainly am not of support of gestures. Orders, please. Oh, thank you. So, Councillor Cathy, the ball is in your court in terms of this recommendation. You are entitled to move it, and you know, we will have a debate.
I wish to second it.
That's very good. Councillor Cathy.
Thanks. I want to talk, just say a few things really about my personal journey to today, and also about our processes that we've been discussing today. First of all, I'd just like to talk about my first meeting with the Ihumatao. It was with you, Mayor Brown. We both went to the Mangere Arts Centre. You've known Ihumatao a lot longer than me. But we went to the Mangere Arts Centre for a photography exhibition. It was Kiane Matata Sipu, who's not here today, but she is watching. And Kiane had these amazing photographs, some of which are in your agenda. They're black and white, and it charted life at Ihumatao. It was in the tradition of Ans Westra, really. Wonderful photographs. But more than that, the people of Ihumatao were there to tell their stories, and some of them are here today and some of them have passed. And it was the most amazing, moving evening of a way of life. And that's what we're all talking about. This uninterrupted way of life that has gone on in Auckland as it's the oldest in Auckland. So that was how it started. The photos came to life. My next involvement with Ihumatao was the pouring of 1,000 litres of purple dye into the Ururangi Awa. And it just so happened I got involved in that because we'd had some local issues at Oakley Creek, and Kiane got in touch to see if we could help. It's a link into council. And that's been described, that was Jenner's worldwide freight. They were fined $100,000. It's been described as, and I quote, Auckland's most destructive freshwater and marine pollution incident in decades. So what happens next is interesting. So that's 2013. In 2014, in this room, we looked at 88 special housing areas. And that number is important because this is where I got onto our processes.